So the question is, can you turn beer into whiskey? So what we have in front of us is two fermenters, one with a beer, one with a whiskey. Let's see if we can turn beer into whiskey. Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Beaver and today we are embarking on the very first episode of the Beer to Whiskey series. And I'm very glad to announce that today's sponsor of the ingredients for our Beer to Whiskey series for the very first one is Prohibition Home Brewers. Now, they kindly sponsored us with a all grain recipe with the ingredients to make a beer as well as a whiskey mash. And today's beer, as you can see there, is an Imperial Stout. So you normally see me pulling out Big Blue over here and using this for our all grain recipes if you're familiar with the channel. But we have kindly been sent a new brewing system that we're going to use on the channel. Now, if you want any more information on the brewing system that we're going to be using, please check the link down in the description. It is a back to basics kind of brewing system. So yeah, pretty excited to use the Delica 35 liter brew system on the channel. With the kettle at a more manageable level, it's time for us to start the recipe. So like I said, first up, according to the recipe, we are going to be adding 20 liters of water to it. Now, if you watched my intro to distilling video up here, we discussed water with a bit more detail. But for the purpose of this video, I'm not going to do any water conditioning whatsoever to the water. I'm going to use the straight water that I normally use to distill with in my beer. Now, if you want to know more about water chemistry and all the other stuff, please check out the video that I'll link up on this side here. It's another channel that discusses water chemistry in a lot of detail if you want to geek out about that. Let's quickly get 20 liters of water into our mash tun or kettle and get it heating up. So while the 20 liters of water is getting to our strike water temperature, let's quickly talk about the recipe we're going to be using today. And as I said in the beginning, we are doing a Imperial Stout, or as the recipe states, a Russian Imperial Stout. Now, in this recipe, we have the following grain. We have 6 kilograms of pale malt, 300 grams of Carafa, we have 300 grams of roasted barley, 400 grams of wheat, 200 grams of Carafa 3, and 250 grams of DRC malt. We will also be using Northern Brewers hops, and we have a hop schedule of 60 minutes and 15 minutes. So yeah, we'll explain a bit more about that when we get to the boil. But first up, let's get our water boiling. We need to heat a strike temperature according to the recipe of 77 degrees. We have the boiler or the kettle turned on, waiting for it to hit temperature. Once we hit it, we'll get to mashing in. So see you then. So with our water temperature now at our strike temperature, we need to now get our grain into our mash tun so we can start that conversion process from starch to sugar. Quick couple of tips when you start this whole process of doing an all grain mash or making a beer. Number one rule whenever you make a beer is sanitization. So make sure everything is cleaned and everything is nice and ready for you to use. So when I say everything, I literally mean anything that is going to become or that is going to be in contact with any part of this process needs to be clean. So get your fermenters clean, get your equipment cleaned, and make sure everything is nice and sanitized before you start the process. So beforehand, I took a bucket with some lukewarm water and some bleach solution, and I just washed everything. Now, while I'm busy in the process, what I'll be using is my no rinse sanitizer, so in between mashes and that type of stuff. So yeah, rule number one, make sure everything's nice and clean. It's time for us to mash in. With our temperature in our mash tun, for those who are wondering, the kettle took 27 minutes to go from normal room temperature water to our strike temperature. And our strike temperature we are aiming for today, taken into an account with the grain temperature as well, we are sitting on exactly 76.4 degrees. So that should be nice and hot so we can add our grain and get that conversion process started. So while we're waiting for the thermometer to come up to temp and tell us if we hit our mash temperature, which should be 67 degrees centigrade, what I want to do is just explain quickly a little bit about the mashing process. Now, two things. Number one, your temperature is very important because you want your amylase to start being activated and convert those starches into sugars. Number two, make sure you have no dough balls. So if you're using a manual mash paddle, or if you're doing like me with a stirrer, what you're going to need to do is ensure that there's no dry clumps of grain going into the into the boiler or into your mash tun, because once those dry dough balls start forming, there's no conversion going to happen on the inside of that. So you're not going to have a very effective conversion from starch to sugar, and you might just lose some grain. So yeah, let's quickly check on the temperature and see if we hit our mash temp. Sitting comfortably at 66.6, 66.7. We should be a-okay for this thing to start the process. So let's get the lid on, let's insulate this bad boy and get the conversion happening. See you in 90 minutes. With 90 minutes elapsed, and it's time to open up this baby to see if our conversion from the starches to the sugar has taken place. Let's crack the lid and see what happened. I'm just going to steal a little bit of the grain bed to see if that conversion, that starch conversion took place. Looks like it. Looks like we do not have a goopy mess anymore. Yep, everything is nice and loose. So that means that the conversion from starch to sugar has taken place. Time now to set the grain bed. So step number one is for us to get the grain bed exposed on top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drain some of this wort up until I can see the grain bed on top. Once I see the grain bed, it's time to start setting it. With the grain bed now just below the surface of the liquid, what we're going to do now is start setting the grain bed. So what we're doing is we're taking a jar of the liquid, pouring it over something so you don't pour a solid stream into the bed. So it just distributes the liquid over the whole bed. All that's happening now is the bed, it's taking up the small particles and getting it stuck in the top of the bed, and only the clear, nice and filtered beer settles out to the bottom, allowing you to have a nice clear beer when you are done with this process. So you're going to do it for about 15 minutes. With the grain bed now pretty much set and the liquid we're getting out at the bottom turning nice and clear, and there's no more of that small grain sediment coming through at the tap at the bottom, what we're going to do now is lift up the grain bed, and then we're going to just rinse through the last couple of liters that we took off to ensure that everything is nice and clear before we take off all the liquid, and then we're going to start the sparge. With all the liquid drained from the grain bed now, it's time to start the sparge. So what we're going to do now is we've got some water at 77 degrees centigrade. We're going to now start doing exactly the same what we did when we set the grain bed by pouring some water over the top, or pouring the water back over the top. We're now just going to pour some water back over the top of it to rinse out any of the leftover sugars. So we need to hit 25 liters for our pre-boil volume. So when we're done with the recipe and we've boiled it for an hour, we have 23 liters, making this a 23 liter batch beer. So we just finished sparging off to about 25 liters, or not to about, but exactly 25 liters of our wort, added it into our boiler, and now we have our boiler on a rolling boil. It's time to start with the hop schedule. Now, any recipe that you'll get online or at your brew shop will have a hop schedule. This specific one is the moment you hit a rolling boil, you need to add your first hops. So this is 50 grams of Northern Brewers that we're going to add into our rolling boil. So with the hops added, we're going to give it 45 minutes before we add the second hop schedule at 15 minutes before the end of the boil. So if you look at your hop schedule, the times that are written there is the times not when you add the hops, but the remaining time on the boil. A normal boil for any beer will be about 60 minutes. So this beer is going to boil now for 60 minutes with this hops in it. Just before we turn it off at 45 minutes, we will add the second hop schedule. So yeah, let's leave it to boil for 60 minutes. 15 minutes left before the end of the boil. Time to add the last hop addition. This is 25 grams of that same Northern Brewers. So going in 15 minutes before we cut the boil. 60-minute timer has just gone off. Time to get this boil switched off and then transferred into the fermenter. Now it is now currently just past 1 in the evening. So what? Okay. It's currently just past 1 in the morning. So what I'm going to do is, instead of getting this to cool down with either a water chiller or putting it into a sink and stirring it up until it's nice and cold, what I'm going to do is just transfer it into the fermenter, get the lid on, and then leave it to cool down during the morning. And then we'll pitch the yeast tomorrow morning. So yeah, let's get into transferring it into the fermenter. It's the next morning and the brew has now cooled down to a temperature that's acceptable to pitch the yeast. It's currently sitting at about 22 degrees, right in the range of the yeast we will be using. Now this yeast also comes with your kit that you get from Prohibition. It is LC016 or a homebrewer pitch number 1. According to them, it is a top fermenting yeast, ferments between 16 and 22 degrees. It has a low to medium flocculation and has a potential alcohol by volume of 11%. They said this is a good yeast to get nice and complex flavors out of the stout. So what we're going to do is we're going to pitch it into our bucket and our fermenter over here. On this side we have the beer that we made last night. On this side here we have the whiskey. Now the difference between the two is quite simple, and this is the purpose of this series. Is this, as you saw, we hopped. Now what hopping means is we're adding that nice beer bitterness to the recipe. Now hops does not translate well when you do distillation. So what I've done for the beer side over here, we did not hop it. And now by not hopping it, we have actually made a distiller's beer, and that is now going to be used to distill. This side here, we have our distiller's beer that we can now put into the still after it's fermented to dry, and we can distill it out. On this side here, we have a hopped beer that we can use to do a side-by-side comparison. So in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to bottle this baby here, and we're going to run the still on this side here, and then we're going to do a side-by-side comparison between the beer and the whiskey to see what kind of flavors we pull through. Looking forward to that. So let's get into pitching our yeast. Now, as always, sanitization. Now this bucket has been standing closed since we added that nice hot liquid into it. On this side here, this whole thing has been sanitized. I just opened it up now for the video because I wanted to show you guys. I had a couple of questions regarding using balloons. Now you can use balloons. I like to use balloons when I use them on my fermenters. What I do is I poke a small little hole in the top with a needle so it does not overinflate and explode. And then before I put it onto my fermenter, I spray a little bit of no-rinse sanitizer into it, shake it out, and then put it over the top. And that should start inflating and not overinflate. And because the CO2 is heavier than the air, what's going to happen is the CO2 is going to sit on top, and it's just going to prevent anything from getting into your brew. Because it's whiskey, not that worried about funky flavors. But on this side here, this is a beer. So we need to now get the yeast in this baby. Step number 1, sanitize. Even if you're using packet yeast or whatever, make sure you get this sanitized. If you do not sanitize these babies, you might just get an infection, especially with your lower gravity beers. With the yeast pitched, it's time to get the lid on this bad boy and let it ferment. Now this is going to take between 5 to 7 days to ferment out. What we're going to do then with the beer is rack it over into a secondary to allow any additional sediment to settle out, and then we'll do the bottling. But yeah, like I said, that's available in the next video that's coming up, when we will be distilling the whiskey as well. And just want to clarify one thing: it's exactly the same mash bill that we used for both the beer as well as the whiskey. So the only thing that changed in this recipe is the fact that we hopped the beer, we did not hop the whiskey. If you want to see more of this kind of content, please hit that subscribe button down in the corner there. Remember to give the video a thumbs up, and as always, leave a comment down below. I'll get back to you as soon as possible, and have a lucky day.